When the Thousand-Year Reich collapsed in May 1945, all of Europe demanded revenge. What followed was a brutal, chaotic, and unequal reckoning that shook 6 nations and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The alliance between Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany had evolved during the decade of the 1930s under an appearance of ideological harmony, although the real dynamics of power indicated from the beginning an unequal relationship. When Benito Mussolini consolidated his regime after coming to power in 1922, he projected the image of a seasoned statesman whose authoritarian methods had served as a model for the rise of Adolf Hitler. Official visits, public speeches, and joint propaganda highlighted the existence of a political understanding aimed at redefining the European balance through force. In 1936, both powers formalized the Rome-Berlin axis, and Italian fascism presented this pact as a guarantee of stability for its territorial ambitions in the Mediterranean. However, the consolidation of National Socialism in Central Europe soon altered that perception of equality. Hitler developed an expansive strategy of dimensions that Mussolini could not replicate, and the German military machinery began to impose itself as the dominant reference in every joint decision. When Italy declared its entry into the war in June 1940, it did so with the expectation of a brief and favorable campaign. The fascist regime aimed to gain immediate territorial gains that would enhance the image of power and modernity of the country. However, the early military failures revealed the shortcomings accumulated over years of propaganda. In Greece, the Italian troops were forced to retreat under the pressure of a numerically inferior but better prepared army, while in North Africa, the Italian offensive crumbled before the British forces. These setbacks forced Hitler to intervene repeatedly, sending divisions that compensated for the insufficient Italian operational capacity. Each German intervention meant for Mussolini an additional loss of strategic independence. As the war progressed, Italy went from being an allied partner to becoming an object of military guardianship, and Berlin assumed increasing control over decisions that, in theory, belonged to Rome. July 25, 1943, marked the definitive break of the internal balance. After a sequence of defeats and the exhaustion of the civilian population, the Grand Fascist Council voted for Mussolini's ousting. King Victor Emmanuel III ordered his immediate arrest and tasked Marshal Pietro Badoglio with forming a new government. Although the fiction that Italy continued to be at war alongside Germany was publicly maintained, the new administration initiated secret negotiations with the Allies. The announcement of the armistice on September 8th surprised much of the army, which lacked clear instructions on how to react to a suddenly reversed situation. The German forces deployed on the peninsula, anticipating the break, immediately executed the occupation of the north and the center of the country, disarming Italian divisions and sending thousands of soldiers to internment camps. Those troops, who until then had fought alongside Germany, were treated as enemies. The rescue of Mussolini by a German commando on the 12th of September in the Gran Sasso altered the political landscape once again. Hitler needed a local government to legitimize the military occupation of northern Italy and to sustain a defensive line against the Allied advance. On the 23rd of September, the creation of the Italian Social Republic was announced, with its operational capital in Salo, on the shores of Lake Garda. Although Mussolini again held the title of head of state, his room for maneuver was virtually non-existent. Relevant decisions were made by German representatives such as Ambassador Rudolf Rahn and General Karl Wolff, who coordinated military and political activity. Under this structure, the RSI became a dependent state with no significant diplomatic recognition beyond that conferred by Germany and some of its allies. The administration of the territory clearly reflected that loss of sovereignty. Various areas were placed under direct German control, including Trieste and Fiume, while South Tyrol was incorporated into the Third Reich. These measures were implemented without consultation with the authorities of Salo, who were limited to complying with the orders imposed by Berlin. Mussolini, weakened and aware that his continuity depended entirely on Hitler, had no capacity to oppose these actions. In the meantime, the reorganized Republican Fascist Party under the leadership of Alessandro Pavolini adopted a more radical tone than that of pre-war fascism, trying to compensate for the reality of an empty authority with ideological fervor. In that context, new military and paramilitary forces emerged to support the German repression. The Republican National Guard, created on the 24th of November 1943, included former members of the Volunteer Militia for National Security and police officers who had remained loyal to the regime. However, its organizational weakness and lack of resources quickly turned it into a minor complement to German needs. To reinforce local presence, Pavolini promoted the establishment of the Black Brigades through a decree signed on the 30th of June 1944. These provincial units, formed by party militants, adopted an aggressive iconography intended to project cohesion and discipline, although in practice they suffered from serious equipment and training problems. The Black Brigades and the Republican National Guard performed essential functions in controlling the occupied territory. Their knowledge of local communities allowed them to identify opponents, monitor suspicious movements, and participate in joint operations with the SS and the Gestapo. The Italian resistance, which had steadily grown since the capitulation of the monarchical regime, took advantage of the mountainous geography of the north and underground networks in urban centers to extend guerrilla activity. In the face of this pressure, the Germans frequently resorted to indiscriminate repression. Anti-partisan operations included night raids, mass arrests, and summary executions. In Vinca, for example, a repressive operation carried out with the participation of the Black Brigade No. 40 resulted in the death of 162 civilians, including women and minors, in an action that reflected the brutality applied to contain the insurgency. Despite their precarious structure, the Black Brigades expanded to include 41 territorial units, as well as mobile formations intended to move through guerrilla warfare areas. Their armament mainly consisted of lightweight rifles and automatic weapons of Italian or German origin, sufficient for local control tasks but inadequate for sustained confrontations against well-organized partisans. German commanders supervised their operations and ensured that actions adhered to the strategic objectives of the Reich. Pavolini, in his role as political and military coordinator, traveled the territory in search of strengthening internal cohesion and ensuring obedience to the leadership of Salo. The violence exerted by these forces increased the rejection of the Italian population. In the industrial cities of the north, workers organized massive strikes during 1944 and 1945, paralyzing entire sectors of production. In the rural areas, the resistance consolidated liberated territories where the fascists could only enter sporadically. The Allied advance from the south progressively reduced the maneuvering space of the RSI, which depended entirely on German supplies. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the military situation of the Axis on the peninsula was critical, and the German commanders concentrated their efforts on maintaining an increasingly fragile defensive line. On the 19th of April 1945, the Allies broke through the last defences in the Po Valley. The National Liberation Committee responded with a general insurrection that overwhelmed the repressive capabilities of the fascist forces. The northern cities were occupied by partisans before the arrival of Anglo-American troops, in episodes of urban combat that reflected the complete disintegration of the RSI. Mussolini tried to flee towards the Swiss border on the 25th of April, but was captured 2 days later near Dongo. On the 28th of April, he was executed alongside several hierarchs, in an outcome that symbolized the definitive collapse of the regime. On the 1st of May, the signing of the surrender in Caserta confirmed the official end of the Italian Social Republic. The fall of the regime gave way to a wave of reprisals that spread throughout northern Italy. The partisans executed numerous collaborators, some after improvised trials and others through public lynchings. The bodies of Mussolini and other leaders were transferred to Piazzale Loreto in Milan, where they remained exposed for hours while thousands of people came to observe them. The scene constituted a symbolic act that returned to the place a meaning opposite to what it had held months earlier. when the fascist authorities had exhibited there the bodies of shot partisans. The intervention of American patrols finally allowed the removal of the corpses and their transfer to the Institute of Legal Medicine for the corresponding autopsies. The weeks following the surrender of the Italian Social Republic were marked by the disintegration of its political structures, the dispersal of its leaders, and the implementation of judicial measures aimed at clarifying responsibilities. As military and civil authorities regained control of the cities, the files opened by the new Italian institutions accumulated documentation on detentions, executions, and displacements that occurred during the years of German occupation. The process progressed with an irregular pace, conditioned by the fragmentation of the territory and the need to restore basic services, but reflected the intention to rebuild administrative mechanisms that had disappeared during the war. In this still unstable scenario, public attention gradually shifted towards immediate political changes, while Italy began a period of transition whose development would depend on decisions that, at that moment, remained unresolved. The collapse of fascist Italy in 1945 coincided with a different but equally decisive process in Romania, where the regime of Marshal Ion Antonescu faced the simultaneous pressure of the Soviet advance, the wear and tear accumulated from years of war, and the internal tensions generated by strategic decisions that had transformed the country into one of the eastern pillars of the German military effort. Romanian political evolution between 1940 and 1945 was marked by abrupt changes, territorial losses, alliances conditioned by the fear of the Soviet Union, and direct participation in military operations that far exceeded the traditional capabilities of the state. The initial stability that Antonescu promised to build became progressively unsustainable as the war moved into its final phase. The decisive turning point emerged in the summer of 1940, when a series of external events altered the territorial architecture of Romania in just a few weeks. In June, the Soviet Union issued an ultimatum demanding the immediate cession of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. With no allies willing to intervene and no military capacity to resist a Soviet offensive, the Romanian government accepted the withdrawal. This retreat triggered an accelerated process of border adjustments. In August, the Second Vienna Arbitration, mediated by Germany and Italy, transferred northern Transylvania to Hungary. In September, the Craiova agreements ceded southern Dobruja to Bulgaria. In less than 3 months, Romania had lost nearly 60,000 square kilometers and approximately 3 million inhabitants without engaging in combat, a fact that generated a profound political impact and unleashed an unprecedented internal crisis since the post-war period. The central figure of the political conflict was King Carol II, whose foreign policy based on balances between the powers had failed. The demonstrations demanding his abdication multiplied, in parallel with the pressure from sectors of the army that pointed to the monarch as responsible for the territorial disintegration. General Ion Antonescu, a military figure with prestige due to his career and his open criticisms of the king's decisions, was called to form a government on the 4th of September 1940. Antonescu accepted only on the condition that the king would renounce. On the 5th of September, Carol II left the country and left the crown to his son Michael, who was 19 years old. With this change, Antonescu assumed dictatorial powers under the title of conducator, reorganizing the state around his authority and reducing the young monarch to a ceremonial role. The alliance with Germany arose directly from the need to establish an external guarantor against the Soviet Union. The Western powers were immobilized or defeated, and Romania, humiliated by the loss of territories, sought to recover what was lost through a military association that would offer protection against the Soviet advance. On the 23rd of November 1940, Antonescu signed the accession to the Tripartite Pact during his first official visit to Berlin. Hitler positively assessed the discipline of the Romanian army and considered Antonescu a reliable partner on the southeastern flank of the front. That relationship was based on both strategic coincidences and the availability of essential Romanian resources for the German war effort. The recovery of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina became the immediate goal of the regime. Operation Barbarossa, launched on the 22nd of June 1941, allowed Romanian forces to enter into war again with the Soviet Union, mobilizing the third largest Axis army after Germany and Italy. After recovering the lost territories, Antonescu decided to continue the advance beyond the pre-war borders. Romanian troops occupied Transnistria, administered by Romania between the Dniester and the Bug. During that period, concentration camps were established and mass deportations of Jews and Roma were executed, integrating the occupied territory into the repressive Axis system. The extent of the front and the lack of preparation for prolonged operations limited Romanian capacity, but the regime maintained its involvement for political and strategic reasons related to the desire to gain full support from Germany. In the military field, Romania contributed more than 1 million soldiers to the Eastern Front throughout the war. The Romanian Third Army participated in large-scale operations such as the Siege of Odessa, which fell in October 1941 after weeks of intense fighting. The losses were considerable from the first months and intensified with the Romanian intervention in the Caucasus region and in the Volga sector. The disaster of Stalingrad between November 1942 and February 1943 represented the most devastating blow. About 60,000 Romanian soldiers died or went missing, and the surviving units were severely weakened. The military and psychological impact of the defeat forced Bucharest to reorganize divisions and rethink its strategy, but the dependence on the decisions of the German command made a unilateral withdrawal impossible. Romania also became an economic pillar of the Reich. The oil from Ploiești, one of the most strategic resources of the Axis, supplied Germany with more than 10 million tons between 1940 and 1944. In addition to fuel, the country provided large volumes of cereals, meat, and other agricultural products necessary to sustain the German military machinery. The economic agreement, signed on the 4th of December in 1940, consolidated this dependency. Although Antonescu avoided entirely yielding economic sovereignty, the weight of the pact left Romania practically integrated into the structure of German war efforts. The country's infrastructure was adapted to the logistical needs of the Eastern Front, and numerous airfields, railways and communication centers were placed under joint supervision. In repressive matters, the Romanian gendarmerie collaborated closely with units of the SS and the Einsatzgruppen in the deportation of Jews both within the national territory and in the areas administered in Transnistria. More than 280,000 people were deported to that region, where conditions of hunger, disease, executions, and exposure to the elements caused massive mortality. Although some Romanian officers opposed specific collaborations or tried to limit German actions against certain political figures, the Antonescu regime was directly responsible for one of the broadest extermination processes on the Eastern Front. The German defeat at Stalingrad changed the internal political landscape. Mihai Antonescu, Minister of Foreign Affairs and a close collaborator of the Marshal, perceived that the situation was unsustainable and sought diplomatic alternatives. Attempts were made to persuade Hitler to negotiate a separate peace with the Western powers, but the German leadership rejected any proposal. Starting in 1943, Romanian diplomats established secret contacts with Allied representatives in Portugal, Spain, Sweden and Turkey. Meanwhile, opposition leaders such as Iuliu Maniu of the National Peasant Party and Constantin Brătianu of the National Liberal Party began discreet negotiations with the British and Americans with the aim of obtaining an armistice to prevent Soviet occupation. Antonescu was aware of part of these conversations, but his tactical loyalty to Germany, combined with his fear of reprisals if he attempted to break the alliance, prevented him from making a definitive decision. Meanwhile, the military deterioration was advancing rapidly. In 1944, following the formation of the Democratic National Bloc, a coalition of opposition forces partly backed by the Communist Party, a plan was organized to depose the Marshal and sign an immediate armistice. A temporary defensive victory in Târgu Frumos in May 1944 gave Antonescu a false sense of stability, but the respite lasted little. The Soviet offensive Iași-Chișinău of the 20th of August, 1944, with more than 1 million soldiers, broke the German and Romanian defences in 2 days. The collapse left entire units surrounded and pushed Romania into an immediate political crisis. Realizing the defeat on the front, the conspirators of the National Bloc advanced their coup. On the 23rd of August, King Michael summoned Ion Antonescu. He insisted on resisting from the Carpathians, but refused to request an armistice. The king dismissed him and ordered his arrest, proclaiming that night the break with Germany and Romania's entry into war against the Reich. The German reaction was immediate, with bombings over Bucharest and the failed attempt to capture the monarch. In a few weeks, Romanian and Soviet forces expelled the Germans from the country. Antonescu was sent to Ljubljanka prison. In 1945, the new government, already dominated by communists, created people's courts to judge war crimes. In total, 668 people were convicted. The central trial was that of Antonescu, started in May 1946, accused of collaborating with the Reich and committing atrocities in Transnistria. Sentenced to death, he was executed on the 1st of June 1946, abruptly ending his political era. The fall of the Romanian regime in 1944 coincided with the accelerated deterioration of another state whose origin and destiny were closely linked to the political project of the Third Reich. In Slovakia, the figure of Jozef Tiso represented the peculiar mix of religious authority and civil power in a context marked by German pressure, ethnic tensions, and the instrumentalization of national institutions to sustain the Axis machinery. The trajectory of this small state reflects how a territory with fragile political structures could quickly transform into a functional ally of Germany, adopting repressive policies and directly contributing to the Nazi war effort in Central Europe. The creation of the Slovak state was a direct consequence of the collapse of Czechoslovakia following the Munich Agreements of September 1938. The Slovak region, integrated into the Czechoslovak Republic since 1918, had developed autonomist movements influenced by the Catholic nationalism represented by the Slovak People's Party. Following the death of its founder, Andrej Hlinka, in August 1938, leadership passed to Jozef Tiso, a Catholic priest ordained in 1910 and an influential figure in political and religious circles. Tiso had served as a military chaplain during the First World War and held positions in the Czechoslovak parliament since 1925. His education at the Vienna Seminary, where he encountered anti-Semitic currents present in Austro-Hungarian politics, influenced his later ideological orientation. The events that precipitated Slovak independence accelerated after the First Vienna Award, signed on the 2nd of November 1938, by which Hungary obtained 11,000 square kilometers from southern Slovakia. Nearly 800,000 inhabitants immediately came under Hungarian administration, creating a sense of vulnerability that fueled nationalist demands. The Slovak People's Party's propaganda blamed internal minorities, especially the Jewish community, for weakening the state and facilitating territorial loss. In that climate of tension, the Czechoslovak government dismissed Tiso as Prime Minister on the 10th of March 1939, suspecting that he was maintaining contacts with Germany. This decision aimed to curb internal disintegration, but had the opposite effect. 2 days after his dismissal, German emissaries transferred Tiso to Berlin to meet with Adolf Hitler. On the 13th of March 1939, at the Reich Chancellery, Tiso heard the warning that Hungary and Poland were supposedly preparing to occupy Slovak territory if the region did not immediately proclaim its independence. The information, presented by Joachim von Ribbentrop, combined exaggerations and falsehoods intended to pressure Tiso into accepting German protection. Upon returning to Bratislava, Tiso convened Parliament, which on the 14th of March unilaterally approved independence. The next day, Germany completed the occupation of Bohemia and Moravia and established the Protectorate, thus ensuring total control over the former Czechoslovakia. The new Slovak Republic was completely subordinated to the Reich from its inception. Tiso was appointed Prime Minister on the 14th of March and later President on the 26th of October 1939. The Protection Treaty signed on the 18th of March formalized the subordinate position of the state. Germany obtained the right to deploy troops and control foreign policy, while Slovakia maintained limited autonomy in internal affairs. The Slovak People's Party became the only legal political organization, consolidating a regime that fused Catholic nationalism with fascist elements. Its foundations included economic corporatism, ethnic exaltation, legislative anti-Semitism, and strong alignment with German military interests. The Linke Guard, a paramilitary organization officially created on the 8th of October in 1938, became the coercive arm of the regime. It succeeded the Rodobrana militia, which had been dissolved by Czechoslovak authorities years earlier. Its structure strengthened after Alexander Mack took command on the 15th of March in 1939, remaining in that position until 1945. The Guard adopted black uniforms, salutes inspired by fascist codes, and a disciplinary style based on strict hierarchies. It grew to register up to 100,000 members, although most lacked professional training. After training with the SS in 1941, its role focused on internal surveillance, repression of opponents, and direct collaboration with German agencies in deportations and population controls. Anti-Semitic policy was quickly institutionalized. The Jewish Code of the 9th of September 1941 applied restrictions based on racial criteria, prohibiting the 80,000 Slovak Jews from practicing liberal professions, participating in educational institutions, and owning significant properties. The obligation to wear the Star of David and the measures of Aryanization facilitated systematic confiscations. Deportations began on the 26th of March 1942, when the first transport transferred 999 women to Auschwitz. Between March and October of that year, approximately 58,000 Jews were deported to extermination camps. The Slovak government paid 500 Reichsmarks for each deportee, reflecting the degree of administrative involvement in the operation. The Linke Guard participated in raids, train surveillance, and the confiscation of goods. In military terms, Slovakia contributed troops to various Axis operations. On the 1st of September 1939, the Slovak army took part in the invasion of Poland with approximately 51,000 soldiers, providing logistical support and flanking coverage. On the 22nd of June 1941, it declared war on the Soviet Union and sent units to the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa. Although its direct military participation was limited compared to that of other Axis powers, the country's geographical position allowed Germany to use its territory as a strategic corridor for troop and supply movements to the east. Starting in 1943, the Soviet advance generated increasing tensions within the Slovak state. The Slovak National Council, formed in November of that year by communist and democratic representatives, began to plan an armed uprising. The transformation of Slovakia into a German logistical base and the growing partisan communist activity in mountainous areas intensified political and military pressure. Romania's switch of sides on the 23rd of August 1944 altered the situation throughout the region and caused concern among sectors of the Slovak army. The execution of a German military mission by partisans on the 27th of August precipitated the German reaction. On the 29th of August, General Ferdinand Chatlosch announced over the radio that Germany was taking military control of the country. 15 minutes later, Colonel Jan Golian transmitted the coded message that activated the Slovak national uprising. The resistance movement initially gained support from units of the regular army, and Banska Bystrica became its operational center. The mobilization on the 9th of September raised the number of fighters to about 60,000 soldiers, in addition to around 18,000 partisans. The insurgent structure included experienced officers and improvised logistical networks, but relied on Soviet support to sustain the resistance. The German response was quick and forceful. Units of the Wehrmacht entered Slovak territory on the 29th of August, accompanied by specialized counterinsurgency teams. At the same time, the Linke Guard formed emergency divisions known as POHG, intended for anti-partisan operations. These units participated in repressive actions, route surveillance, and the pursuit of hidden Jews. It has been documented that around 5% of their personnel were involved in war crimes. The Einsatzgruppe H, created to ensure the deportation of remaining Jews, coordinated activities with these formations. Between September 1944 and March 1945, approximately 13,500 Jews were deported, and around 5,000 were detained. The capture of Golian and General Rudolf Wiest on the 3rd of November marked the final phase of the insurgent collapse. By the end of October, most of the uprising had been neutralized, although guerrilla groups continued to be active in mountainous areas until the arrival of Soviet forces. The Tiso regime collapsed in the first weeks of 1945. The government retreated to Austria in March, while the Red Army advanced towards Bratislava. The capital fell on the 4th of April. On the 8th of May, Slovak authorities surrendered to American troops in Kremsmünster. Tiso hid in a Capuchin monastery in Altötting, Bavaria, where he was detained by American troops in June of 1945 and extradited to Czechoslovakia. Other leaders of the regime, such as Wojtek Tuka and Alexander Mach, were also arrested. The trial of Tiso began in December 1946 before the Czechoslovak National Court in Bratislava and lasted for more than 4 months. The charges included treason against the state, collaboration with Nazism, responsibility for the repression of the uprising, and direct participation in the deportation of Jews. On the 15th of April 1947, he was found guilty of all charges. Although sectors of the population and some political figures requested clemency due to his priestly status, the court upheld the sentence. On the 18th of April 1947, Tiso was executed by hanging in the prison of Bratislava. The execution presented technical complications that prolonged his death. His body was initially buried in an anonymous location to avoid acts of public exaltation. In 2008, his remains were transferred to St. Emmeram Cathedral in Nitra, generating debates about the historical memory of the period. The judicial processes continued beyond the Tiso case. Alexander Mach was sentenced to 30 years in prison, although he received amnesty in 1968. Members of the Hlinka Guard involved in war crimes faced various sentences, while Hermann Höfler, the German officer responsible for the final repression of the uprising, was extradited, tried and executed in 1948. The Slovak state formally disappeared after the war, rejoining Czechoslovakia until its peaceful separation in 1993. In the autumn of 1944, Hungary was going through a phase of accelerated disintegration. The German occupation had dismantled the last mechanisms of political autonomy, and the state apparatus was operating under direct supervision of the Reich. In this scenario, the rise of the Arrow Cross Party transformed the internal situation in a matter of days. The takeover of power by Ferenc Salasi, supported by German commanders, marked the beginning of a political system that would apply, without restrictions, the most extreme forms of violence and control that Nazism had developed in Central Europe. The trajectory of this movement dates back to the consequences of the First World War. The Treaty of Trianon in 1920 had reduced Hungarian territory to 1/3 of its previous extent and left about 3 million Hungarians under foreign administration. This collective trauma fueled a sense of national grievance that polarized political life for decades. From this climate emerged Ferenc Salasi, an army officer trained in Austro-Hungarian academies and a member of the General Staff since 1925. After retiring from active service, he began a political career based on radical nationalism that combined territorial irredentism, authoritarianism, and racial anti-Semitism. In 1935, he founded the National Will Party, although it was banned for subversive activities in 1937. In 1939, he reorganized his movement under the name of the Arrow Cross Party, directly referencing the German National Socialist model. The ideology of the movement, called Hungarism, aimed to fuse extreme Hungarian nationalism with elements of Italian fascism, Austro-fascism, and racial doctrines of Nazism. Its distinctive symbol, the arrow cross, was presented as an ancestral ethnic emblem. The aesthetics included green shirts, armbands with the cross, and militarized salutes. Salasi, lacking solid doctrinal training, nonetheless developed an ideological corpus in which he attributed a central role to Hungarians in a supposed future geopolitical order dominated by Germany and Japan. Although these conceptions lacked practical foundation, they managed to attract significant sectors of the electorate, especially among urban workers and impoverished peasants. In the elections of 1939, the nationalist-oriented parties obtained 49 seats, of which 31 corresponded to the Arrow Cross. About 750,000 voters supported the movement, highlighting the political potential of extremism in a context of persistent social inequalities. However, the conservative regime of Admiral Miklos Horthy maintained control. Salasi was arrested repeatedly, and the party was made illegal again at the start of the war. Hungary's military collaboration with Germany in Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union did not entail handing over power to the Hungarian fascists, but it did deepen political dependence on the Reich. The internal situation was decisively changed in March of 1944. Hitler, convinced that Horthy was not guaranteeing full alignment with Berlin, ordered the occupation of Hungary through Operation Margaret. German troops entered without organized resistance, and Prime Minister Miklos Kálai was replaced by Domher Sztójay, who was more favorable to Germany. One of the first measures of the new government was to once again legalize the Arrow Cross Party and allow its reorganization. Administrative collaboration enabled the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews during the period between May and July of 1944. About 437,000 people were sent to Auschwitz from rural areas, in an operation carried out with extreme speed. Horthy tried to stop the deportations at the end of July by replacing Sztójay with a more moderate government. However, in the face of the Soviet advance, the regent attempted to negotiate an armistice with Moscow. The radio announcement on the 15th of October 1944, declaring the intention to abandon the war, provoked an immediate reaction from Germany. Commands led by Otto Skorzeny kidnapped Horthy's son and threatened to execute him. The regent was forced to resign, and the parliament, under German pressure, chose Salasi as head of state. On the 3rd of November, Salasi was sworn in as leader of the nation, a title equivalent to Führer, thus consolidating the party's dominance. The Salasi government established a puppet regime completely subordinate to the Reich. Its first strategic measure was to resume the deportations that Horthy had halted. Between October of 1944 and February of 1945, approximately 80,000 Jews were deported from Budapest to concentration camps. In parallel, tens of thousands were forced to march on foot to the Austrian border for forced labor under extreme conditions. The cold, hunger, and executions significantly reduced the number of survivors. By the end of 1944, the Arrow Cross authorities established the central ghetto of Budapest to concentrate the remaining Jewish population. The enclosure was closed, remaining under permanent surveillance and exposed to conditions of severe overcrowding. The violence exerted by the Arrow Cross militias against Jews and opponents intensified in Budapest during those months. Armed patrols carried out summary executions in public places, especially in the vicinity of the Danube. It is estimated that between 10,000 and 15,000 people were directly killed by militia members during Salasi's rule. The practice of taking victims to the bridges, tying them up or aligning them on the banks of the river, and shooting them before throwing them into the water became one of the most documented methods. The corpses remained visible on the banks for hours or days, reflecting the brutality of the regime. The Soviet advance towards the Hungarian capital defined the decisive phase of the conflict. On the 29th of October 1944, the offensive against Budapest began. More than 1 million Soviet and Romanian soldiers advanced on the city from multiple directions. On the 26th of December, Soviet units cut off the Budapest-Vienna road, completing the encirclement. Salasi had abandoned the city on the 11th of December, moving west with the crown of St. Stephen and other national symbols. The defense was left in the hands of approximately 33,000 German soldiers and 37,000 Hungarians, in addition to about 800,000 civilians trapped inside. Hitler declared Budapest a fortress city and prohibited any withdrawal. The siege of Budapest, which extended until the 13th of February 1945, became one of the most intense urban battles of World War II. Operations began in the peripheral neighborhoods of Pest at the end of December. On the 18th of January 1945, Soviet forces took control of the entire eastern sector. Before retreating to Buda, German troops blew up all the bridges over the Danube, destroying essential infrastructure such as the Chain Bridge and the Elizabeth Bridge. Fighting in the western sector intensified due to the mountainous geography that favored defense. Conditions within the city deteriorated rapidly. The lack of food forced the sacrifice of horses for consumption, and the winter temperatures severely affected defenders and civilians. To break the siege, the German command launched 3 offensives called Konrad the Fast and the third in January of 1945. Although the third operation managed to get within about 30 kilometers of the city, all of them ended in failure. Units from the SS Panzer divisions Wiking and Totenkopf led the attacks, but the deeply entrenched Soviet defenses prevented the advance. The Red Army suffered significant material losses, including nearly 1,000 tanks, but maintained constant pressure. The resistance within Buda became unsustainable in early February. Finally, on the 13th of February in 1945, the last defenders surrendered. It is estimated that around 40,000 German and Hungarian soldiers died during the siege, while the rest were captured or wounded. Soviet casualties amounted to approximately 80,000 dead and 240,000 wounded. For civilians, the consequences were devastating. Only 25% of residential buildings remained intact, another 25% was completely destroyed, and the rest suffered severe damage. During the siege, the Arrow Cross militias continued their repressive activity within the city, even when Soviet forces were already a few kilometers from the center. On the 18th of January in 1945, Soviet troops liberated about 70,000 Jews who were confined in the central ghetto. Thousands more survived thanks to the intervention of diplomats like Raoul Wallenberg, Karl Lutz, and Angel Sans-Brice, who issued protection documents and maintained safe houses under consular immunity. Despite these efforts, the overall toll of the Holocaust in Hungary was enormously destructive. Out of a Jewish population of approximately 825,000 people in 1941, more than 568,000 were murdered. After leaving Budapest, Salasi headed towards Austria with the remnants of his administration. On the 29th of March 1945, he arrived in the Matzi region, where he was captured by American troops on the 6th of May. He was extradited to Hungary on the 3rd of October. On the 1st of March 1946, he began his trial before the People's Court of Budapest. The charges included treason against the state, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The charges documented direct responsibility for deportations, forced marches, mass executions, and the continuation of anti-Semitic policies under German occupation. Salasi maintained a firm attitude during the sessions, defending the legitimacy of his government and justifying his decisions as a response to the military situation of the country. On the 12th of March 1946, the court issued its sentence. Salasi, along with Gabor Vajna, Karoli Berigfi, and Josef Gera, was sentenced to death. The execution was carried out by hanging on the 12th of March 1946 in the courtyard of the Marco prison. The body was buried under a false name to avoid public outcry. In parallel, the People's Courts judged more than 22,000 collaborators. At least 6,200 sentences for murder were issued, and hundreds of those responsible for the most serious crimes were executed. Leaders like Kalman Hubai, Fidel Palfi, and Andras Chia faced similar trials. The party structure was dismantled, and post-war Hungary was marked by the magnitude of the crimes committed during the Arrow Cross period. When the Axis powers destroyed Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941, Croatian territory became the scene of one of the most radical collaborationist administrations created during the war. The independent state of Croatia, formed under the direction of the Ustasha movement and led by Ante Pavelić, combined extreme nationalism, systematic violence, and repressive autonomy to implement policies that surprised even German authorities with extensive experience in occupation operations due to their intensity. Between 1941 and 1945, the regime developed a state structure that linked its own political objectives with the strategic needs of the Reich, generating an internal dynamic marked by ethnic conflicts, mass deportations, and military operations carried out with few administrative or humanitarian limits. The roots of Croatian collaborationism date back to the creation of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovens in 1918, reorganized as the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1929. In this new multinational state, Serbian political dominance fueled persistent tensions with Croatian nationalist sectors. Among those sectors emerged Ante Pavelić, a lawyer and ultranationalist militant who founded the Ustasha movement in 1929 following the assassination of the Croatian peasant leader Stjepan Radić in the Belgrade parliament. Condemned to death in absentia by King Alexander I, Pavelić fled to Italy, where the fascist regime utilized him as an instrument to erode Yugoslav stability. During his exile, he coordinated clandestine actions, including participation in the assassination in Marseille in October 1934, where the Yugoslav monarch was killed. This episode solidified Pavelic's reputation as a leader willing to use violent methods to advance his nationalist project. The military collapse of Yugoslavia occurred in April 1941. On the 6th of April, Germany and its allies began the invasion. On the 10th of April, even before the German troops entered Zagreb, Pavelic's lieutenant, Slavko Kvaternik, proclaimed the independent state of Croatia. The decision was made under the direct supervision of SS Brigadeführer Edmund Fesenmeyer, special envoy of the Reich to coordinate the political reconfiguration of the territory. Pavelić returned from Italy on the 20th of April and assumed the title of Poglavnik. The new state included Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and western parts of present-day Serbia, configuring a territory of about 6.2 million inhabitants under nominal Ustasha sovereignty and German and Italian operational control. The regime formalized its dependency through the Treaty of Rome on the 18th of May 1941, which ceded a large part of the Dalmatian coast to Italy. Pavelić formed a government on the 14th of April, granting Andrija Artuković the Ministry of the Interior, from which the harshest repressive policies were articulated. On the 27th of April, the systematic persecution of groups considered hostile to the new order began: Orthodox Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political opponents. The Ustasha authorities collaborated militarily with Germany from the very beginning. On the 10th of April, parallel to its proclamation, the Croatian Legion was created, intended to integrate into the Wehrmacht for operations on the Eastern Front. Nearly 10,000 volunteers joined these units, reflecting the regime's readiness to actively integrate into the military structure of the Axis. The racial and religious policy of the NDH was designed to transform the demographic composition of the territory. The anti-Semitic laws, adopted since April 1941, replicated and in some cases surpassed the German provisions. Artuković publicly declared the government's intention to resolve the Jewish question more quickly and radically than Germany. At the same time, a program was implemented aimed at drastically reducing the presence of Orthodox Serbs through deportations, forced conversions to Catholicism, and mass eliminations. This combination of administrative and coercive measures generated a climate of continuous persecution. The central instrument of repression was the network of concentration camps directly controlled by the Ustashas. From August of 1941, the regime established more than a dozen independent facilities from the German system. The largest of them, Jasenovac, became the operational center of the extermination policy. The complex, divided into 5 sub-camps, covered an area of about 240 square kilometers along the banks of the Sava and Una rivers, about 100 kilometers southeast of Zagreb. The organization of the camp reflected an autonomous structure without German technical supervision, which allowed its administrators to apply improvised and extremely violent execution methods. Prisoners were classified by colors, blue for Serbs and red for communists, among others. German and Croatian records show practices of manual violence that differed from the German industrialized model: executions with knives, beatings with clubs, drownings in water tanks, and other improvised methods. The number of victims at Jasenovac remains the subject of historiographic debate. Investigations by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum estimate between 77,000 and 104,000 people were killed, with a predominance of Serbian population, along with Jews, Roma, and Croatian and Bosnian opponents. Institutions such as Yad Vashem have suggested higher figures, reflecting the breadth and documentary complexity of the period. Beyond the specific numbers, the site became the axis of the extermination policy of the regime. On a national scale, estimates place the number of Serbs killed in the territory of the independent state of Croatia between 300 and 30,000 and 390,000, along with more than 30,000 Jews deported to German camps or killed in Croatia, and tens of thousands of Roma. These figures reflect a repressive effort that combined autonomous practices of violence with the partial implementation of the German model. The intensity of the Ustasha actions caught the attention of even German authorities. A report from the Gestapo sent to Heinrich Himmler on the 17th of February 1942 attributed the increase in partisan activity to the atrocities committed by Ustasha units against the Serbian civil population. Observers like Hermann Neubacher, political representative of the Reich in the Balkans, described witnessed episodes as examples of cruelty hardly comparable to other scenarios on the European front. These reactions did not imply ethical reservations on the part of the German officials, but rather concern for the military stability of the territory. The military and political wear and tear of the NDH accelerated towards the end of 1944. The partisan forces led by Josip Broz Tito were progressively advancing from the south and the east, while the Croatian state structure was losing administrative cohesion. In May 1945, with Germany already collapsed, Pavelić ordered the general withdrawal of the government and armed units to Austria. The magnitude of the displacement varied according to sources, but it is estimated that between 200,000 and 600,000 people participated in the withdrawal, including soldiers from the Croatian army, Ustasha militiamen, civil officials, and part of the population fearful of reprisals. The columns faced constant attacks from partisan units. The Battle of Poljana on the 14th of May in 1945 resulted in hundreds of deaths among combatants and civilians. The ambushes in alpine areas caused approximately 30,000 additional casualties before reaching the Austrian border. On the 15th of May, the main columns arrived in the Bleiburg area in Carinthia, where they attempted to surrender to the present British forces. The negotiation, led by Croatian General Ivo Hrencic, focused on obtaining recognition as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. However, the directives of the British command stated that any Yugoslav unit that had served alongside Germany had to be disarmed and handed over to Tito's forces. The surrender was rejected, and thousands of prisoners were transferred to the Yugoslav authorities. The repatriation of prisoners led to a series of mass executions that lasted for several weeks. Between the 20th of May and the beginning of June 1945, groups of prisoners were sent back to Yugoslavia in columns forced to cover great distances without supply of water or food. The marches, later known as death marches, caused the deaths of tens of thousands of people. Those who could not continue were executed along the way. In places like Tesno, near Maribor, mass graves containing around 80,000 bodies, mostly Croatian soldiers and civilians, have been identified. Other locations, such as Kočevje, Huda Luknja, and rural areas near Zagreb, hold graves with thousands of additional victims. The subsequent judicial processing developed unevenly. Some Ustasha officials were tried in summary proceedings in Zagreb in June 1945, and executed after one-day trials. However, several leaders managed to evade justice for decades. Pavelić escaped to Austria and later to Italy, where he hid in religious institutions before traveling to Argentina in 1947, with documentation issued by the International Red Cross. Settled in Buenos Aires, he organized movement structures in exile. After an assassination attempt in 1957 that left him seriously injured, he moved to Spain, where he died in 1959 without facing trial. Artuković, a central figure in the repressive politics, managed to enter the United States with a false identity. After a prolonged legal dispute, he was extradited to Yugoslavia in 1986 and sentenced to death, although he was not executed due to his health condition. He died in prison in 1988. Other high-ranking officials followed similar paths. Eugen Dido Kvaternik, a key figure in clandestine operations preceding the war, took refuge in Argentina and died without being prosecuted. Vyacheslav Luburić, directly responsible for Jasenovac, lived in Spain until 1969, the year he was murdered under circumstances never fully clarified. The Ustasha regime, although dismantled at the end of the war, left a lasting impact on the region, particularly due to the scale of its repressive operations and the complexity of the subsequent judicial process. By the end of the decade of 1940s, Croatian territory was fully integrated into the new socialist Yugoslavia. Institutions needed to be reorganized in a context marked by material destruction, mass displacements, and the necessity to document the violations committed during the period of the NDH. Subsequent investigations and judicial processes progressed irregularly, but contributed to establishing a more accurate record of events and structuring administrative mechanisms in a territory deeply affected by the war. In the spring of 1945, Germany was in total collapse. The state apparatus that had sustained the Third Reich ceased to function in an integrated manner as Soviet troops advanced through East Prussia and Pomerania, while American, British, and French forces penetrated from the west. The centralized administrative structure that had characterized the Nazi regime fragmented into dispersed units without coordination capability. On the 30th of April, with Berlin surrounded, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the Chancellery bunker. From that moment on, institutional continuity was limited. The complete military surrender was signed on the 8th of May, marking the formal end of the war in Europe. The days before and after the collapse were accompanied by a high number of suicides among regime authorities and members of military and civilian institutions. Documents compiled by the Allies recorded that more than 50 generals of the Wehrmacht took their own lives in the final period of the war, along with a significant number of high-ranking officials from the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine. Some political leaders followed the same pattern. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, committed suicide on the 1st of May, while leaders such as Heinrich Himmler or Leonardo Conti avoided capture through similar methods. These deaths prevented in many cases the carrying out of subsequent judicial proceedings. The civilian population also experienced a notable increase in suicides during the final months. Police and health records compiled in 1945 indicate that in Berlin alone, more than 7,000 suicides were documented between January and April, coinciding with the most intense phase of urban battle and the Soviet occupation. In regions such as Western Pomerania, cities like Demmin recorded especially high rates, with estimates ranging between 1,200 and 1,500 self-inflicted deaths between April 30th and May 4th. The causes combined effects of administrative collapse, lack of security, disruption of basic services, and the presence of occupying armed forces. Allied documentation also recorded a significant number of crimes committed against civilians, including episodes of sexual violence in different regions, especially in territories that came under Soviet control. The total scale of these events continues to be a subject of historiographical debate due to the fragmentation of sources, although the most cited estimates place the number of victims at figures ranging from hundreds of thousands to several millions across German territory during 1945. After the surrender, the Allies proceeded with the complete occupation of the country. The Potsdam Conference, held between July and August of 1945, defined the division of the territory into 4 zones: Soviet, American, British, and French. Each power assumed administrative responsibility for its zone and implemented specific policies. The occupation included territorial control, reorganization of basic institutions, collection of official documentation from the Nazi regime, and detention of individuals considered relevant for investigations of war crimes. The arrests began immediately. By the 1st of January 1947, the Western powers had detained 182,000 people. In the British zone, 64,500 individuals were arrested and 34,000 were subsequently released. In the American zone, 95,250 people were detained and 44,244 were released after initial review. In the French zone, detentions reached 18,963 people, of which 8,040 were released. The Soviet zone showed the lowest rate of releases: 67,179 detainees and 8,214 released. The classification, review, and processing of these groups constituted one of the first administrative challenges of the occupation. The Soviet Union relocated a considerable number of German prisoners of war to camps on its territory. It is estimated that nearly 2 million German soldiers and civilians were deported for forced labor in the USSR between 1945 and 1947. The number of deaths in these camps varied depending on conditions, length of internment, and assigned activity. The last prisoners were repatriated in 1955, reflecting the prolonged duration of Soviet policies towards German military and civilians considered responsible for indirect or direct participation in the Reich's war machine. At the same time, Western powers coordinated to judge the main surviving leaders. The International Military Tribunal, established in Nuremberg, began in November 1945, the trial against 24 high-ranking officials of the Nazi regime. The charges fell into 4 categories: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit them. The selection of defendants was based on political, military, or administrative relevance. The hearings lasted until October 1946. The tribunal handed down 12 death sentences, 3 life imprisonments, 4 prison sentences of varying lengths, and 3 acquittals. Among those acquitted were Franz von Papen, former Chancellor, and Hjalmar Schacht, former Minister of Economics and Director of the Reichsbank, reflecting the complexity of assigning individual criminal responsibility in a highly centralized regime with broad administrative structures. After the main trial, 12 additional proceedings took place between 1946 and 1949 under American control, directed at medical personnel, jurists, industrialists, heads of security police, officials of the Ministry of the Interior, and military leaders. These proceedings addressed specific areas of responsibility within the machinery of the Reich. The sentences included prison terms and executions, although a considerable number of those convicted had their sentences reduced in the following years. The gradual realignment of Allied priorities towards economic reconstruction and geopolitical containment of the Soviet Union favored more flexible evaluations. The denazification policy was one of the central components of the post-war administration in the Western zones. The United States implemented an evaluation system based on forms called Fragebogen. Approximately 16 million questionnaires were distributed between 1945 and 1947. Completion was mandatory to obtain work permits, access to rationing, and reintegration into public institutions. The questionnaire contained 133 questions related to affiliation with the Nazi Party, associated organizations, participation in Hitler Youth, military ranks, activities in state bodies, and positions held from 1933 to 1945. The system classified people into 5 categories: main offenders, committed, moderately committed, supporters, and exonerated. The assigned category determined access or restriction to public and private jobs, civil rights, and the possibility of being subjected to legal proceedings. The strict application of the system produced significant operational difficulties. Essential professionals for reconstruction, engineers, doctors, teachers, administrators, had often been formal members of the party or linked organizations. American and British commanders observed that a rigid application would have paralyzed essential sectors for social and economic stability. In the beginning of 1946, with the onset of tensions between blocs that would lead to the Cold War, the American and British authorities began to gradually delegate the responsibility of denazification to German organizations, which resulted in a notable increase in the number of people exonerated. The final figures reflect this trend. In the American zone, nearly 33% were classified as exonerated. In the French zone, around 50%. In the British zone, approximately 90%. Most of the sanctions were limited to fines or temporary restrictions from exercising certain functions. In 1951, the authorities of West Germany formally abolished the denazification system. In contrast, the Soviet zone implemented broader measures. The Eastern authorities introduced agrarian reforms, expropriated properties from Prussian landowners, nationalized more than 2,000 companies, and purged officials deemed linked to Nazism. Nearly 30,000 people were tried by Soviet courts, and approximately 500 received death sentences. The Soviet administration allowed individuals with a Nazi past to hold minor positions as long as they were considered politically reliable and aligned with the new socialist system. Denazification in the East was integrated into a broader process of political, economic, and social transformation that resulted in the creation of the German Democratic Republic in 1949. The institutional reconstruction of West Germany progressed in parallel with the integration of former officials with limited responsibility or classified as sympathizers. Later studies have pointed out that numerous public figures of the post-war era had held relevant positions during the Third Reich. In 1965, a report prepared in the German Democratic Republic, known as the Brown Book, identified several hundred former members of the Nazi Party who held prominent positions in the administration, judiciary, armed forces, and ministries of the Federal Republic. Among them were high-ranking officials who would later perform significant political functions. Although part of that information catered to the propaganda interests of the Eastern Bloc, later academic research confirmed the significant presence of former party members in institutions of West Germany during the first decades of the post-war period. The management of the Nazi past within Germany evolved unevenly. During the immediate years following the war, the Allied priority focused on preventing the political reorganization of Nazism and establishing minimum bases for civil administration. By the late 1940s, the transformation of the international landscape and the necessity for economic reconstruction partially shifted attention away from individual responsibilities. Nevertheless, German judicial institutions resumed investigations in later decades. In the 1960s, trials were conducted against personnel from concentration camps, especially in Frankfurt, where members of the SS who had served in Auschwitz were prosecuted. Memory and education policies regarding the Nazi period gradually developed, becoming integrated into school curricula, museums, and documentation centers. In 1945, Germany faced an environment characterized by food scarcity, urban destruction, and territorial fragmentation. The Allied military administrations supervised the restoration of basic services, the partial reactivation of the economy, and the progressive return of displaced civilians. The documentary work included the collection of archives, inventory of state assets, and reconstruction of vital records. The largest judicial process was still in its initial phases. The complexity of the administrative system of the Reich, the territorial extent of the crimes, and the magnitude of institutional participation required prolonged efforts that continued for subsequent decades. As the months passed after the surrender, German society began to reorganize local and regional structures under Allied supervision. The provisional administrations restored basic procedures in municipalities, courts, and supply agencies. The immediate priority was to ensure the minimum functioning of essential services while evaluating the political and administrative responsibilities arising from the Nazi period.